Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second in a series of seminar events being hosted by the Inland Center for Sustainable Development, which is a research arm of the School of Public Policy at the University of California, Riverside. My name is Rick Bishop. I'm one of the staff here at ICSD. I also wanted to take a moment or two to acknowledge some of the other staff that help make ICSD possible and provide much of the research and the products that you see on the website. We have Dr. Ron Loveridge, who is the ICSD founder and senior advisor. Dr. Chin-Fong Wang is a professor at UCR and is also an ICSD co-director. Kristen Kopko is our principal management analyst. And we also want to provide our gratitude to Dr. Mark Long, who is the chair of the School of Public Policy at UCR, is unable to be with us, but we appreciate his support and guidance. Just real briefly, for background, ICSD was formed in early 2020, is intended to serve as a network center, an honest broker, and a resource in policy analysis on issues that impact future growth in the two inland counties, being Riverside and San Bernardino. Our focus has been and will continue to be on how best to incorporate practices that can simultaneously address growth, equity, and environment in our region. Our research to date has been funded by members of what we refer to as our Leadership Council. They're both private and public sector entities in the two counties. They provide our funding that allows us to do our work. They also provide leadership and guidance on the various topics that we undertake during the course of the year. With that in mind, I wanted to welcome two of our Leadership Council members and entities that are with us. Charity Schiller is with the law firm of Best in Krieger. In fact, we'll be having Charity as a guest at one of our upcoming Randall Lewis seminars to talk about the various pieces of California legislation that impact environment and economy. We also are pleased to have Nicole Pritchard, who is with the Irvine Foundation, who is with us as well. To see a listing of all of the ICSD research funders, Leadership Council members, and all of the research efforts and papers that have been published to date, we would ask you to visit our website at icsd.ucr.edu. As far as today's topic, I'll mention that several months ago in the spring, we held a focus group, which consisted of a number of experts and practitioners in the field of manufacturing and logistics. And we wanted to learn from them as we were moving in a direction to embark on developing a work program for the center that would look at logistics and manufacturing as a focus. I think those of you that are in this seminar today, as well as our panelists, this is one of the biggest land use issues that impacts and will continue to impact our two county region. After we completed the focus session, it became apparent to us that that session alone, it was evident that we had much more to learn. And so we decided to expand our listening efforts to develop and implement a number of seminars, of which this second seminar is one of those, so that we could get more input on a range of issues that we think impact the region as it pertains to manufacturing and warehousing. So we're very, very glad to have you in on this second session today on October 11th, where we're going to be examining the impacts of this industry on pollution and public health in the two county regions. Just as a quick reminder, on November 1st, also at 4 o'clock, we will be having our third of expected 4 or 5 sessions where we'll be looking at the impacts of the industry on employment, quality of jobs, and the transportation system. So stay tuned for more information coming from ICSD to that. We're recording this session. After the session, you can certainly go to the ICSD website and review it, as well as the very first session that was put in place a few weeks ago. We have that. We also have a chat and a Q&A box for those that are attending. If you have questions that arise, come to mind during our panelists' comments, feel free to put those in there. We cannot guarantee that we'll be able to address every question during this quick hour, but we, with the consent of our panelists, will take those questions and we will convey those to our panelists, hopefully that they will respond, and then we'll return those to all of you in the ensuing week or so. So without further ado, let's get to our introducing our panelists. We are very pleased to have a number of experts on this issue of public health and pollution with us. We appreciate their time. We have Anna Gonzalez, who is the Executive Director for the Center of Community of Action and Environmental Justice. Anna, thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it. We also have Ian MacMillan, who is the Assistant Deputy Executive Officer for the South Coast Air Quality Management District, SCAQMD or AQMD. Ian, thank you for joining us today. Obviously important in developing policy on this. Dr. Susan Phillips is a professor of environmental analysis at Pitzer College, has a long history of expertise in this field as well. Dr. Phillips, thank you for joining us. And then also Dr. Laren, who is a chair and associate professor at Loma University, the School of Medicine. So all, thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate that. So without further ado, let's get to our questions. Again, we'll be mindful of our time. This is a 1-hour session. We'll be ending at 5 o'clock. Again, if you've got questions, comments, feel free to use the Q&A on this. So let's start with the first one, and I'll ask the question, and this is a free-for-all. You can jump in at any time to be the lead or respond to others. So very first question, discuss the most important impacts of the concentration of warehousing and logistics industry on public health in this region. And then a second piece, do you or your organization, do you have direct or indirect experience with these impacts?
Anna, I think you should go.
I was just going to say, thank you so much. Well, happy Wednesday, everyone. Again, I have the privilege of being the executive director at the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice. We are a base building organization, community-based. So we actually take lead from the community. We never come into community spaces and tell them what to do, but instead they tell us what they need. And from there, we collaborate and we make things happen. Next year, we're going to be celebrating our 45-year anniversary of being in community and advocating for water and air quality issues. And most recently, we have been able to serve 8 priority cities in both San Bernardino and Riverside County. And so really quickly, warehousing has been a big issue in our communities, but most importantly, the staff and the team that we have here at CCAJ are all community members of frontline communities. And I'll give you my story. I became involved with CCAJ when I found out that my son was developing asthma because of our environment. And my community, I used to live in North Rialto, became boxed in by warehousing. Literally north, south, east, and west of our street was boxed in by warehouses. And so it got so egregious that trucks started idling in front of my house, next to my kids' schools, and it just became a horrible sight. And recently I moved to the downtown area, and now warehouses are coming to the downtown area. And really quickly, I wanted to share what happened last night. We were at a city council meeting in the city of Rialto, where I am from and where my family lives. And they voted on a warehouse that's 100 feet away from my house, in front of my house, and 60 feet away from a park. So it's directly adjacent to a park and across the street from homes. And so these are the issues that we are seeing and facing, not only as staff, but as community members all over the IE. So yeah, that's our story.
And I wanted to echo on what you were saying, as not only just the chair of the Department of Medicine at Loma, I'm also a pulmonologist. After coming back from UC Davis, started our obstructive airway disease clinic here at Loma because we noticed that there were a lot of respiratory illnesses that were being exacerbated by our environment. And also, we could say, by a lot of these particular matters that are being given out by whether it be vehicles or perhaps fires around the area. And when you just look at the statistics around, right, within Riverside County itself, you've got somewhere along the line, around like about 6% of COPD patients, which comes up to be about 150,000 COPD patients. You add asthma patients to that, which is about 15% for Riverside County, and that's another 390,000. So just combined itself in Riverside, you've got a lot of patients that are susceptible to really environmental changes that could worsen their respiratory conditions, just like what you were stating, Anna. And so these are the things that we have directly seen at Loma Linda, indirectly also seen through our clinics. And it's such a significant impact because really we know in these type of instances, the best thing that we need is clean air, right? And I will say the bias that I have is that the best thing that could go into lungs is clean air, and it should be clean air. And I understand it's tougher and it's getting harder, especially as local governments and elected representatives are seeing these opportunities to grow the communities, but at what cost? And I think this is where it's always very critical to have all of us here to be able to talk about it, how we can make this a sustainable way to make it better for our communities.
Ian, do you want to go or no?
I'm
Yeah.
always shy. I don't know. Feel free. You go first, Susan. I can
Okay.
follow up on one.
Yeah, that's fine. I just wanted to sort of say thank you to Anna and Dr. Tan that the idea, I think we're barely beginning to understand what the toll of warehouses is. And it literally just starts with pollution. And I think it's great that pollution has gotten so much attention. And honestly, Dr. Tan, the statistics that you're citing, I mean, we need better study. We don't have refined enough data. You know, Cal and Virus Screen is working off of data that's from like 2014 about asthma. I mean, we're really, really desperate for study here because what we need is to have ironclad proof of, you know, this relationship, even though it's been demonstrated in the literature again and again and again. It doesn't seem to matter to, it's not that it doesn't matter, it's just that the, you know, municipal leaders and local agencies continue to make decisions that ignore that data, that ignore the best scientific data that we have, and the best health data. I think two big things that I think have happened as a result of warehouses that have been detrimental to public health. One is that warehouses have driven a wedge between communities and municipal leaders. And they have really made, you know, who leadership is aligned with change. And that is a public health issue that needs to change. But the other thing is, this is not just about air pollution. And I think the danger here is to narrow down the solution to electrification. And that's where everybody is going. And that's what everybody thinks, oh, the fleet will be electrified. We've got the infrastructure. It'll be fine. That is basically, pollution is the tip of the iceberg. And we need to talk about total environmental health. We need to talk about light, noise, vibration, unwalkable cities, unbikeable cities, the inability to be outside, the inability to be inside of your home, the view shed, and then the impervious surface coverage. We're talking about 60 square miles of concrete, right? And there's the carbon footprint of that has not even ever been calculated. There's massive amounts of carbon that have not been calculated as a result of warehouses. And then the real killer is urban heat. The urban heat increases. Absolutely, the lack of urban forestry, the lack of trees, etc. There's no attempt to create buffers. That warehouses are a kind of threat multiplier in the time of climate change. So they multiply existing problems, health and education inequalities, socioeconomic difficulties, all this legacy stuff that, you know, why has CCAJ been around for 45 years? It's because there's heavy legacies of toxicity in the soil. There's toxic dumping, there's water issues. And the problem now is that heat is becoming a major issue. The Inland Empire and actually Riverside and San Bernardino counties suffer from the most intense urban heat island index in the state of California. That was as of 2015. The other paradoxical thing that I'll just mention and then I'll stop is that if you clean the air, and if you clean it from diesel PM 2.5, if you electrify, suddenly you have clean, bright skies, that's going to make the urban heat index much, much worse. And it will also increase ozone. So this footprint is a sick footprint. And I was watching like the Blue Zone series yesterday on Netflix. And I was like, oh, this is exactly the opposite of that. This is like a dead zone they call it a diesel death zone for a reason. Anyway, that's my comment. I will stop. Thank you.
Just quick follow-up, Dr. Tan, somebody mentioned in the Q&A that maybe perhaps you could share some of the information you have on air pollution and public health impacts, either now or later on. Any high-level 30,000-foot comments or observations that you might have?
I was going to actually just put that where I got some of my information down on links from CDPH, and also where I actually got from Shape Riverside County too, was another of my sources in preparing for the talk.
Okay.
I'll put that in the chat.
Fantastic. And one of the comments that came in the chat was one of the staff from the city of Lake Elsinore mentioning their recent adoption of, I'm sure you're familiar with this, good neighbor policy guidelines that a number of jurisdictions and entities have adopted in the last several years to attempt to address in some fashion some of the impacts. And I think, Dr. Phillips, that many of them are kind of broad in that they're looking at, site and situation and placement of the buildings and egress and, things of that nature. Could maybe all of you comment on your experience with those good neighbor guidelines, to what extent you think they help, where they might be improved upon, or where they fall short?
I know Ian hasn't spoken yet. We could talk about Fontana. I don't know. I don't want to monopolize.
Maybe I'll jump in a little bit, just give some of the work we've done at South Coast AQMD. So hearing what you're saying, what Susan just said about, it's more than just air quality. We are a single kind of issue agency, obviously, that air quality impacts a lot of different parts of daily life and, the economy and everything here in Southern California. But I think, when we've looked at warehousing, and we've looked at this from the CEQA lens, and I'll say I've dealt with that for many years, of trying to look at the land use side of things. Our agency, we're the regional air pollution agency for our region, the 4-county region, but we are not a land use agency. We are just a commenting agency. And so very similar to the public in some ways, in that we can comment and the lead agency is going to make the decisions that they feel are appropriate, but we can comment about, what we think is good public policy with regards to air quality. But there's limits there. And so I think what our agency has looked at, and what, others like the State Air Resources Board and EPA have looked at, as what are the regulations that can be put in place to try to address air quality, at least for that issue, right? And part of the reason that we've looked so heavily at this is that warehousing attracts a lot of trucks. It's not really a big surprise there to say that. In our region, trucks are the largest source of emissions that contribute to regional smog. That is changing pretty soon. We expect ships will be the largest and trucks will be the second largest. But the reason for that change is that there's been so many regulations that have come along and incentive programs that have come along to really try to turn over that fleet. And I can speak to what our agency did with our warehouse rule. The reason we took a look at regulating warehouses was because of this impact, primarily on regional smog, looking at that ozone, looking at that fine particulate matter that blankets, in particular, the Inland Empire. And what we do see is that the solutions to reduce emissions for ozone and PM, those work together. It's the same technologies. You reduce the one, you reduce the other. We do see some benefit there from tackling both those pollutants at the same time. that more was needed to get at that regional pollution. But then we also hear, of course, the local concerns. What Anna was just talking about of, hey, it's right in the backyard. There's instance after instance of these land use, the proximity of the warehousing to homes, schools, daycares, et cetera. That's widespread, not just in the Inland Empire, in LA County as well. And so we hear about those concerns too. So we developed a regulation to try to come up with some different options that warehouse operators could take, and really it was looking at all those impacts regionally and locally and trying to come up with some regulatory solution that our agency can do within our purview, but then of course advocating with CARB to take the actions that they can do under their authority, advocating with EPA, leading that petition for them to do on their truck regulations, because a lot of trucks are sold out of state first. And so really trying to look at this from as many lenses as possible to try to get at the air quality issues that we see with warehousing. That said, I'd be remiss to say that while there are many concerns that we hear about air quality and other issues like the ones that we've heard, whether it's traffic, light, aesthetics, what have you, there are also, it's an economic engine, right? Goods movement in the Southern California region, it is an economic engine, and that's likely to continue for a long time. It's continuing to grow, despite all the regulations that have come along in California and in our region. Warehousing has grown substantially, and we expect that will continue to grow. And so I think what we're most interested in is how do you, if that growth is going to occur, how do we do it in a responsible way so that we actually protect public health while we're doing that? We think that is definitely a very realistic scenario, but it has to be intentional.
So Ian, just a real quick follow-up. So, we've heard in a prior session, and most people know this, that, one of the biggest air quality impacts of this industry comes from mobile sources, planes, trains, automobiles, which largely are not regulated by AQMD. So how does a bridge occur, with an issue that is, prevalent in the Inland Empire? Maybe you could take a minute and discuss, what the district's authority is and what it isn't, and where responsibility lies elsewhere to address this.
Yeah. So for our region, about 80% of the nitrogen oxide emissions come from mobile sources. I cite nitrogen oxides because that's the primary pollutant that is the precursor for ozone and fine particulate matter for that regional smog. We're required under the Federal Clean Air Act to meet ambient air quality standards on certain timelines. 2023 is a milestone, 2031, 2037. We have to meet ozone standards. So we have to reduce NOx. And those mobile sources that you cited, trucks, ships, locomotives, aircraft, et cetera, those are largely regulated not by our agency. They're regulated first by EPA, sometimes internationally, if you're looking at ships, also in some ways with aircraft. And then also by CARB. And those are the two agencies with primary authority to regulate these sources. What we've seen is that the regulations that have come down and the incentive programs that have been made available, it's substantial, but not enough. And we know that more is needed to meet these air quality standards. And if we don't meet these standards, our region faces significant economic harm. We have sanctions that will come down from the federal government that are non-discretionary. So loss of federal highway transportation funding, significantly increased cost to get an air permit, maybe even a permit moratorium, federal takeover of local air quality regulation. So significant impacts to the economy of Southern California, which can affect public health. Getting back to your point, how does South Coast get involved in this? Under state law, the local air districts like South Coast AQMD have been given primary authority when it comes to something called an indirect source. And that is looking at a facility like a warehouse or a port or a rail yard, and then the mobile sources that go to and from that facility, and regulating in that space, which is different than how CARB regulates or EPA regulates on the engine manufacturer or the vehicle manufacturer, or on the fleet operator, whoever owns the trucks or whoever owns the rail, the locomotives. We look instead just at the facility. So it's a different way of doing regulation. So that's, we took a look at that authority that we have and developed our warehouse rule, because not enough has happened at the federal and state level as of yet. And we continue to advocate more needs to continue to happen, in particular at the federal level.
So maybe Ian, or any of you could maybe give a couple examples on what are kind of some of the, one of the questions that came in on the Q&A, what are some of the low hanging fruit solutions that might help address some of these public health issues that have already been put in place? What's out there that's working?
I'll start off only just to talk about some of the regulations, but I definitely want to hear from others, because that others have much better ideas. But just on the regulations that have come along, I'll just cite off some of the most significant ones. With particular to trucks, EPA recently passed their clean truck regulation, which lowers NOx emissions and addresses some of the in-use emissions impacts that we've seen. So it updates that truck fleet for out-of-state trucks. CARB has 4 new truck regulations that have all come down in just the last few years, requiring manufacturers to develop zero emission trucks, requiring fleets to purchase those zero emission trucks. For those that aren't zero emissions, manufacturers need to produce cleaner burning trucks, and then also in-use requirements to essentially smog check for trucks. So those are some significant new regulations. We, have our warehouse regulation that's out there. This is a very dynamic space regulatory when it comes to regulations. It's like nothing I think folks have ever seen. It's a really active space when it comes to regulations. There's a lot of funding that's coming along when thinking about low-hanging fruit. The federal government, through bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of funding is coming along that can really help cities, counties, communities to put new solutions into place where money is needed. It's going to require partnership and coalition building, but there is opportunity now with this funding that is once in a lifetime kind of funding. So that's, at the high level, some of the things that we're seeing.
Anna or Lauren, do you want to go?
Yeah, I wanted to share something really quick that's actually bringing us some progress. And I want to talk about really quick about SB 1000. So what we're doing in some of the cities where we have the biggest base of community, we're assessing and making sure that cities have implemented the EJ element, which is the environmental justice element, into their general plans. And with the EJ element, we talk about access to food, cleaner, transit, EJ policies. Right now in the city of Rialto, I was lucky to be appointed to the advisory committee for the general plan update, which is bringing a new EJ element to the city. And we are coming up with policies such as banning rezoning from like commercial residential zoning to industrial, to not allow the continuation of rezoning those types of zonings to industrial, to allow more warehousing. Because what's happening in these cities, we are running out of land, and specifically industrial land. So what's happening, a lot of these developers are coming in, displacing people, buying out homes and even schools in some cases, so they can rezone the land and build a warehouse where there used to be a community. And so if we use SB 1000 as a tool that's already law and make sure and enforce it with these cities, we're able to come up with policies like this that prevent, the growth of more polluting industries to come into our communities. And so that's something that has been working for us, but also the leadership in those cities has to be open about having these conversations and stop doing pay for play favors, that if a developer donates to their campaign, then they vote for these projects. And it shouldn't be that way. So we're working with these policies in different cities, enforcing SB 1000 and EJ element and good neighbor guidelines and all of that. So those are tools that we have in our toolbox now that we can enforce in the cities to improve the quality of life of communities.
I want to piggyback on that. I don't think there's any low-hanging fruit at all. Like, I think this is a totally uphill battle. I think it's been an uphill battle for over 20 years. and it's worse than ever. And the compounding impacts of it are worse than ever because of climate change. And we don't yet, I think maybe a low-hanging fruit could be, let's talk about climate change. Like, let's really talk about what is happening. Like, if you read the news, if you can adjust your algorithm on Apple News to be about climate change, you will, be reading some very serious things. This type of land use is exactly the opposite of what we need to be doing in order to mitigate that. That has to do with people's health. It has to do with environmental health. It's a really, really, we're at the tip of, kind of a tipping point here of which direction are we going to go in. The best thing that we could do is invest in green infrastructure and take advantage of some of that infrastructure funding that's coming in. That's like, oh, electrification, plug in your trucks, all that stuff. We actually need to buy land and put it under conservation, because that is the biggest win solution for the environment, for people, and for a green economy, a blue-green economy. So I think that there's definitely, there's not low-hanging fruit that I can see. I think that, for example, to piggyback on what Anna's saying, the community, a colleague of ours has created this idea of a community veto in a case where there's a zoning change in a city. And cities could adopt this. Like, if anybody's out there listening, this would be a great thing to do for your city. If there's a zoning change and the certain number of people are in an EJ community, say, and a certain number of people are objecting to a project who live next to the project, you, the developer, don't have to live next to it. You, usually the municipal leader, doesn't have to live next to it. If the people don't want it, you need to pay attention. I mean, the other thing is a simple thing. Again, it's not low-hanging fruit, but it's a simple thing you could do. Projects that come in EJ communities, the community voice comes in right at the last minute. So it seems like, oh, they're just disrupting everything. We've had this really smooth trajectory for like 2 years. And, it's like, oh, the community input is right at the last minute. But that's the kind of engagement or meaningful engagement that they have that's required by SB 1000. But it's really not meaningful. It's really ticking a box, and it doesn't change things. And so if you had a situation where you could, ask people within municipalities, say, if you're going to pitch a project, we run it by the community first. That's something. Like, we have the community at the table. That's actually something you could implement cost-free. It doesn't cost a dime. What it costs is changing a mindset. And that's the thing that's not the low-hanging fruit.
I echo on that too, Susan, especially when it comes to, at least from the healthcare sector and patients in general. I noticed actually after coming back that these respiratory illnesses used to be exacerbated by, I used to get sick, right? That would be the one inciting event. And now, as we are starting to educate our patients just how much the environment plays a role into it, it amazes me how some will come in and say, it's because the air pollution is horrible. That's why I can't breathe well today. And I know this is the reason why it's affecting me. I think now trying to pull that all together with the warehouses, with the various different sources of emissions, I think is going to empower our communities to be able to step up and say, look, I am not well now 360 days of the year because of this. And I think as physicians or as just the healthcare community, I think we can help support that, because we see them continuously, and we know that access to healthcare is getting harder and harder, especially within the Inland Empire. So I think there are some things that we can do, but I think the bigger part, at least from where I'm standing in a lot of ways, is also just a lot of education that needs to be able to link our communities to what's going on with their health.
Yeah, really good comments. And so it's kind of a follow-up here, and there's probably a bunch of questions in this one. So, one of the themes that I'm seeing in the chats and the Q&A is, how can local representatives, how can the public have more readily accessible, tangible information, on these proposals that are understandable and accessible and maybe even centralized? And so each of you might have access to information, but, a member of the public who works full-time and comes home might have difficulty, even Google searching and, being able to compile things. So a couple questions come to mind. One, we have the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, which is, the nation's most stringent review mechanism in place. How does that fit into review of, the impacts from these proposals? What is good about CEQA? What doesn't work as it relates to air quality impacts and public health impacts? I want to follow up with you, Dr. Phillips, more on, beyond air quality. Let's look at lighting and impervious surfaces and heat on effects and walkability, things of that nature. Where does CEQA succeed and where does it fall short in being able to address the impacts that you all have raised in this? And then secondly, can you cite any examples where local jurisdictions have done a really good job of pulling in the public to educate them and seek their input beyond, the 3-minute public hearing, comment period that they typically have? So I'll kind of start with that. Anybody?
Maybe I'll jump in first. Just on the CEQA side, I was a CEQA practitioner for almost a decade, so I kind of know a lot of the ins and outs, for better or worse, on it. I would say at a high level, CEQA is really unique and really good in that it provides a structured mechanism to provide the public with information about the impact of a project. Right. And just the mere fact that it shines light on what is going to happen to the environment. And so I'd say that's really great. The other part that it does is it requires mitigation to the extent that it does require mitigation. But that is really unique. And so that's, you look at other states, you look what the federal government requires, you look at what other countries require. That is different how CEQA does that. Many would argue it should go farther. And I know I've been on some of those arguments as well, saying it should go farther. But it does do some of that really well. What I think is really challenging with CEQA is it's, in many cases, it can be inaccessible to the public because it gets very complex. And to Susan's point earlier, how much low-hanging fruit is left? Not a lot, if any. And what ends up happening is that what is left is complicated. And so how do you explain to somebody who's just come home and they've got 2 kids that they have to feed, who are angry and they've got soccer practice and they're, and then, okay, I've got 30 seconds to have an explanation about something. That's really hard to engage in that space. So that's, I think, one of the real challenges that CEQA has. To your second question, I'll just give a little plug here to what the Air District has been trying to do on community engagement. We, of course, have our formal processes with our governing board, and anytime they take a vote, that has a very typical government look to it. We are trying to engage more through staff interactions out in the community, holding a lot more community meetings. We have the AB 617 Community Air Protection Program process, which there's a lot of things that could be said about it, but it requires a lot more engagement. And there is a lot more engagement to try to hear more community voices to shape how we do, the policies that we do at the Air District. It's limited to what we do versus what other agencies do, but it is one model to try to just increase engagement. Definitely want to hear from others, though.
Anna, are you going to go or?
Yeah, I can
Yeah,
go
go
real
ahead.
quick.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, CEQA is a very important document and process that it's needed to analyze the impacts of projects, and not just warehouse projects, any project, right? It could be housing projects, it could be commercial projects, it could be anything. One of the things that we have seen, however, is that if folks are not looking, especially community members or advocates for health and safety, is that unfortunately, the leadership that gets to vote on these projects is not equipped or understands CEQA that well. And unfortunately, they're led by staff telling them, oh, this project met all the requirements and mitigations, therefore you should vote for it. And they vote for it. And what we found on the other side when we engage community in this process is that, they do address the impacts and they always say, well, this project's going to cause significant but unavoidable things that's going to harm the community. So as long as it says that, like, the project's good to go. But we disagree with that part, because I think CEQA should go further than that and say, no, if this project is going to bring harm and the impacts are significant and unavoidable, it's actually avoidable if you don't build the project, and then you can stop that from causing harm into a community. But unless you're looking and you're following the process and you're participating in the process, then most of the time the whole thing is missed. But when we are paying attention to it and the leaders still vote for it, then we have an opportunity to use the law to our benefit and do all these lawsuits. But unfortunately, community members and even CBOs like ours don't have that money or resources to just hire a bunch of lawyers and chase all these projects and look at the CEQA violations and go after them. Because for the most part, when we identify the most egregious projects, we have been able to do lawsuits and we have been able to address those impacts. However, we're not able to stop the project because we don't have the resources to go to full trial or to show that this project is actually going to harm. So it has its pros and cons. But I think that there has to be something further done through the CEQA process or at the state level or even at the local level that say, if a project is showing harm that's going to cause harm into a community, you should not approve it, period. And so that's a whole nother debate or conversation that we can get into. But it has helped us stop harm or it has helped us prevent some of these impacts to be as egregious as they could be if we wouldn't have that process in place.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I think CEQA has the potential to be wonderful, and in practice is not. In practice, it's become sort of a technocratic, like very technical. You have to know it can be thousands of pages of material, short timelines. Community members don't know how to read it. Maybe they speak English. They don't speak English. Like there's lots of problems with even accessing those materials. And then the mitigation is like death, the warehouses are like death by 1,000 cuts. Maybe the mitigation puts Band-Aids on 50 of the cuts. Like that's literally what is happening. The game, it's like you have to know how to play a game. You have to know how to play the game. It is a game with a predetermined outcome, which is that the project will move forward. That is always the outcome. There is no meaningful engagement with the alternative project requirement in CEQA, which could be something much more interesting and much more engaging of the community, and is not. And again, that's not because people are malevolent, although some of them may be. It's because of the timing of it, that it all happens in this certain way that really excludes community, so that it then becomes a game of expertise. It becomes a game of experts, like lawsuit. Oh, you have to comment in certain ways on certain CEQA things in certain parts of the EIR, which is like this 1,000-page document with a bunch of addendums. And then the community member who goes to city council pouring their heart out about the fact that their kids have bloody noses at night, that voice doesn't matter. And that's the tragedy of CEQA. That voice doesn't matter. It becomes about everyone guarding themselves against and trying to prepare for legal action instead of paying attention to the kid with the bloody nose. And I always think of it as like all of the municipal leaders who vote for warehouses, they would never like punch a kid in the nose. They would never like hold their hand over a kid's mouth so that they couldn't breathe. But they're essentially voting for things that do that. Kids respirate a lot faster, their lungs are developing. They have very high rates of asthma. And essentially those votes are doing that. Nobody is, I just think there needs to be, in this time in particular, because of climate change, we need to rethink what CEQA is doing. We need to recategorize how it looks. And we need to rethink the planning process to not just be about local municipalities, but to be about the region, because regional issues are completely missed by the planning process. And we need to plan regionally in order to prepare ourselves for planetary crisis and how it comes home to roost for us. Warehouses are absolutely making that equation worse.
So based on what I'm hearing, Anna, I think you said you were in Rialto recently and the council, approved a project, and and it's not just Rialto, but I'm sure all of you or many of you have been to a number of these meetings where these issues, logistics and warehousing proposals are being considered. So when you hear the policymakers who are voting to affirm these projects, what are you hearing them talk about when they're casting those votes? And maybe more importantly, what are you not hearing them talk about? Because I'm guessing that the public health, air pollution, offset impacts probably aren't being brought up by them, if anybody.
Yeah.
They tend not to talk about the numbers of truck trips, by the way. This is the funniest thing of all. It's like, oh, we're adding 2,000 truck trips. They're not talking about that. It's really weird. They definitely listen to people, but they also listen to people want jobs, especially the construction jobs. And those are good jobs. We should have construction jobs, but they should be building hospitals. They should not be building more warehouses. They should be building housing. They should not be building more warehouses. They should be working on infrastructure that trucks have ruined. They should not be building more warehouses. It's asinine at this point in time when we have so many warehouses already. They're operating under capacity. The number of ports coming into the region is declining. It's not a good time to keep doing this. And it's time to let's have a different vision. Let's change our bottom line. If our bottom line is people's health and public health and environmental health, what decisions will we make? That's what I would like to know. That's the conversation I would like to have.
So Dr. Tan, have you or your colleagues been invited by any jurisdictions to provide comment and perspective to these kinds of proposals from a public health pulmonology standpoint?
Not that I'm aware of within our group, and our division is close to about 12. But I know that there's been a lot of work that Ian and his team, I've heard, have been doing, especially we're working closely with the American Lung Association too. But all these things would be very helpful to hear our perspective, because the healthcare cost burden is just as important as the economic growth that is happening to the city. That's the other component that, sure, we may be netting some income coming in, but we're losing just as much because of the healthcare cost that is going out to treat these illnesses for our families. All these things need to be taken into consideration.
Okay, so let's move to the next question. It's an easy follow-up. So we've had some general discussion of the issue. What strategies would you recommend to address the future growth of the inland region with public health in mind? I mean, this it's easy to say, well, we just shouldn't have it, but it's coming. So how do you address it? How do you mitigate it? How do you make this a more acceptable from a public health standpoint issue? Or if it's not the right solution, why not? What public policy issues are missing, and how should local jurisdictions pull them in and think about things differently?
I just want to say that the overwhelming consensus that this is inevitable is wrong. That it is in the minds of people. It is a well-worn path that people have taken again and again. It is not inevitable. We can choose to do different things. So when you say it's coming, it's actually crumbling on one end and on the other. There's definitely things happening that are not good, and they're not good for cities. Cities don't get money out of it. There's shitty jobs, all that stuff, right? It's not a great economic engine for the IE. We already have, 1 billion square feet, 1.4 billion. Do we need to keep doing this? We have a massive infrastructure we could work with to do some really cool stuff. And then we could work to do other cool stuff. Anyway, I'm going to stop. I've been talking too much. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dr. Phillips, I was only talking about the inevitability as far as, there probably are a number of approvals already on the books, that are on the way.
There are, and they need to stop. Literally, it's time. It's time to call it.
And I definitely agree with Dr. Phillips, because we have thrown our cities out of balance. And when you look at the government code of the power that local leaders have and the police power that they have for zoning, they have to look at three things: the health, safety, and well-being of the community. And if those things are not being considered, then they're like actually going against their power or against what's in the statute for them to control, right? And so I feel because we've thrown our cities out of balance, we need to start looking at more sustainable solutions or development that can come to our communities, such as we talk about this huge transition to clean energy and electrification and all of that. But our region is like 25 years behind from what other cities are already doing across California and across the country. And we can bring in those good jobs and good, especially infrastructure jobs to upgrade and retrofit and do all kinds of stuff that are great for our community, better skilled jobs, better paying jobs with benefits. So there's like, the opportunities are endless and there's just so much out there that we can do. But the other thing to consider is that, and we talked about this in the meeting last night in Rialto, is that if you look at the damages to the cars, to infrastructure, to plumbing, to water storm drain and all of that, if you start adding all of those impacts that are being ruined, but essentially by warehousing and trucks coming into our communities, it is way far greater than what they're actually bringing in as talking about economics, right? So we have millions of dollars that cities are paying out to community members because their cars are being ruined because of the potholes and whatever, or there's a home that their sewer system went out because the sewer was outdated or whatever, and now you're paying $1 million to a community member. So if you start adding all that up, and especially the health impacts of when you visit hospitals and the bills because we don't have access to healthcare, all of that is causing much, much more harm and costing our communities, especially our counties and cities, millions of dollars that they have to pay into, while these folks that come from out of our region that live in Beverly Hills, Newport Beach, get to go back to their fancy, clean air home with billions of dollars in their pockets, while we get stuck with the detrimental impacts and essentially bankrupt status. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add on that.
One of the things I did have a question on it, and this is just me just not knowing much in terms of urban development and what is taken into consideration. But what I've seen with my patients that I've seen is that they live in certain remote areas, but the wind blows that pollution toward that area. So is there a wind assessment that is done when it comes to these urban planning of warehouses? And I know that wind is it could be very nebulous, it could be unpredictable, but there are certain patterns that it constantly keeps blowing, like we could say from the ocean towards the inland. So is there, I don't know, and I know I shouldn't be probably posing this question, but I was just wondering.
Maybe I can take that one. I would say yes, it is considered under SQL analysis. There's technical modeling that is done that looks at like a health risk assessment, as it's called. It does a modeling analysis. It looks at the local wind patterns. That wind data is collected by AQMD, made available for everybody to use. We also do our own modeling assessment that looks at not just how, the impact from one warehouse on the neighborhood downwind, but you look at collectively everything coming from LA County and Orange County and Riverside and San Bernardino, and that all gets up in the atmosphere and it bakes up there with the wind patterns. And what does that do? And we do those kinds of analyses too. Is that all appropriately considered and mitigated during land use decision making? I would argue not. But yes, it does. There are tools available for that. Looks like we just lost our moderator.
That's weird.
I think we're free to just really go to town now.
It's riff now, yeah.
Well, Ian, just to follow up on what you're saying, is healthcare leadership also given that information? So this way they are aware that, hey, there's a warehouse that's being built 10 miles down the road. You guys are all going to be in this pathway, in this pattern. Maybe you can there is a possibility to expect more illnesses to arise or something to that degree. I'm just wondering, are we thinking more? Are we educating more? Are we letting people know more about this?
Yeah, I don't think that linkage is necessarily there through the CEQA process. there is some outreach, but not that connection that you're talking about there. That doesn't quite occur. Our agency, of course, interacts with all the local health departments, but that's not the same thing that I think you're talking about on these individual land use decisions. I'm not aware of that kind of process. I wanted to follow up, if I could, on the clean energy side of it. I think that is, what are the opportunities? There is some, I think, real interest in trying to develop, new clean air solutions. Understanding that, just because you electrify a truck, does that solve all the issues? No. Does it solve some issues? Yes. Or is it hydrogen, which has its own issues too, but it's hydrogen, I think, has a role for certain applications. But developing that green infrastructure in the Inland Empire, where you have hundreds of millions of square feet of warehousing, not just the chargers at a warehouse, the distribution system upstream from that, and then also the energy generation, solar panels, et cetera. How do you actually generate all that energy? Is the Inland Empire just going to be pulling resources in, or generating it own internally and doing that work internally in the Inland Empire? And is there opportunities for warehouses to help in that space? I think so. I think there is that opportunity to try to get at some of these solutions for the existing framework.
Good question. Hey, we only have a few minutes left. I'm sorry, my internet went out, so I probably missed the most important comments of the whole panel. So forgive me if I've missed this, but with a few minutes left, these are really good comments, and we appreciate not only your comments, but we have a really active listening audience as well. So there's a lot of questions that we'll be sending out your way for comment. But in the few minutes left, it seems to me what I'm hearing is there's just a lot of information that people aren't aware of, both in the public and perhaps among our policymakers who ultimately make the decisions on approving or rejecting these proposals. How can the Inland Center for Sustainable Development, how can we find a niche in this field? I have a feeling it has to do with information gathering and dissemination to different audiences, but I'll leave it to each of you. Each of you take a minute or so. Let's know what we can do. Ian, I'll start with you since I see you on the screen.
Yeah. One thing we haven't really talked about here that I think might be an area of interesting research. Well, actually, I'm going to touch on two. The first one was Susan mentioned truck traffic. We're collecting some data through our warehouse rule on truck traffic that's never really been collected before at the granular level that we have it. There's still a lot of work to do on that, on the data we have, but what is the truck traffic from warehousing and how is that changing through time? I think there's some interesting work there. But the other one that I wanted to tee up, thinking about a research center, some interesting questions. You look at the growth of goods going through our port complex in LA and Long Beach, and the growth there, say from 2000, 2005 time period to today, versus the growth in warehousing, and they're not equal. Warehousing is growing significantly faster and has continued to grow significantly faster. There is increased growth at the ports, but warehousing is growing faster. Why is that? I think what you also see is that there's a decrease in on-dock rail, and there's a shifting in how goods flow through our region. And I think that's an interesting area to look at when thinking about these larger land use patterns. What's happening overall in the goods movement system? So.
Great, thank you. Dr. Phillips.
I think that you all can be really helpful in bridging, the different groups as you have been, which is wonderful. I think you can probably be helpful to kind of create pathways or think about pathways for leveraging funds federally from the IRA and other opportunities, this unprecedented amount of money, but not necessarily to just think of like always just making bad practices slightly better, but to really, oh, there's two of you, that's really freaky, to think of actually investing in something different and like coming up with how do we redefine green infrastructure so that it's not just about technology, so that it's actually about biodiversity and planetary health and cooling and all of these things. I think that you definitely have a role to play because you are playing the role of sort of bridging it. The last thing I'll say is, agreeing on a set of principles for the siting of warehouses is extremely important and has been a non-starter at the, the state level. That is, I think, a conversation that needs to grow. I was going to go on, but I noticed it's 5:01. So
yeah, 5:01. Okay, Anna, take a minute or so, and then Dr. Tan will finish off with you.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ditto everything that Dr. Phillips just mentioned. And I do believe that you guys are very instrumental in networking and bridging us, like she said, because we need to have like these roundtable discussions or these types of conversations with all the parties and stakeholders, including elected officials, where we can have these courageous conversations and come up with solutions instead of always complaining and, saying we don't want this, and just really have, I guess, this one-stop shop place where we can have these conversations and walk out of there with solutions and do what's best for the communities. And also creating some type of dashboard on your website or whatever platforms you use, where we can connect all of these folks, such as AQMD, CARB, like everybody, and CBOs that are doing this work in the region. So if community members have questions or don't know where to go, they can easily find this information somewhere and connect with folks if they need to. But yeah, pass it over.
Thanks, Anna. Dr. Tan.
I don't have anything else more to add, except just the fact that I really appreciate what the team is able to do in bringing us all together. And I think linking other groups and growing it to where we're able to provide additional insight is going to be so helpful as we continue to discuss more on these topics.
Great. So Anna Gonzalez, Ian MacMillan, Dr. Susan Phillips, Dr. Laren Tan, thank you so much for your expertise and insight. Those of you that are attending virtually, thank you. This is a super involved and engaged group. We've collected all your questions. We're sorry we weren't able to get through all of them, but we will do our level best to compile them, to disseminate them to our panelists and get responses back out to you. So on behalf of us at the UCR Inland Center for Sustainable Development, thank you for attending. Again, thank you panelists for your candid comments. We'll look forward to seeing you again on November 1st for our next scheduled panel. That'll be at 4 o'clock. We'll be looking at the quality of life, jobs, and transportation impacts on this very important industry. So I'll ask the panelists to just stay on the line for just a minute or two to debrief. And again, those of you that attended, thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you on November 1st.
Thank you.